Okay. Yeah. Um, Now where did my PowerPoint go? Okay. My PowerPoint up, Carly?
Yes.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I thought about trying to come up with a really fancy name for this webinar, but after about 10 seconds, I realized maybe I should just call it what it is, street sweeping webinar. So I'm really excited about having some great speakers today lined up. I won't be speaking very much, fortunately for our audience. Today we have Dr. Sarah Hobby, Aileen Malloy, Hillary Yantz, and Bill Selbig from the USGS. And I'm going to have Randy Neprash. He promised me he's going to keep it to 2 minutes. I know that's tough for Randy, but he's going to give us a little 2-minute intro. I'd like to do some acknowledgments before we get started. The University of Minnesota researchers who did the work to help us build this sweeping tool and the guidance that is going to be discussed later. The staff from the cities of Roseville, Shoreview, Minneapolis. I'm missing the city here. Which city is blocked? Forest Lake and Prior Lake, who allowed the researchers to collect data that was used to develop the tools. A technical support team that helped review our materials and guide us through the whole process. And of course, our contractors at Tetra Tech. Just some logistics. The webinar is being recorded. We are offering 1.5 professional development hours. Please put your questions in the chat box. We'll probably defer questions to the end unless it's a real relevant question. Everyone is muted, but if necessary, we can unmute people, except for the speakers, of course, they have the ability to unmute. And eventually everything will be posted in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. So if you just go into our manual and type in the search box, Stormwater Manual Webinars. You should get to all of this information. I'll flash this again later. Just real briefly, why did we do this work on street sweeping? We came to realize from a bunch of work done at the University, Bill Selbig, who's our speaker later today, has been doing work on this, and we realized that street sweeping can be a cost-effective practice for reducing phosphorus. We lacked the phosphorus credit here in Minnesota, and we wanted a credit that was based on the actual material collected. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center, Stormwater Research Council for funding the research that was done by the University of Minnesota. And we used that information to develop the relationships, to develop the tool and guidance that the Tetra Tech staff will talk about later. The guidance is currently in development, but it's draft, and that we'll be talking about that a little bit today. And as Bill will talk about later, there's a lot yet that we don't know. So with that, I'm going to introduce Randy Neprash for a couple minutes. And Randy is a PE, and he was a staff person for the Minnesota City Stormwater Coalition. He's recently stepped away from that so that he can do more work. He's a founder and currently a vice chair of the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. It's an organization comprised of state and regional coalitions of MS4 permittees. He is also a stormwater regulatory specialist with Stantec. So Carly, if we could pass, I'll stop sharing. If we could pass the ball to Randy and let Randy go.
All right, Randy, you should be all set.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks, Mike. I'm Randy Neprash. I am coming to you from the Twin Cities in Minnesota. I am with Stantec, the Minnesota Cities Stormwater Coalition, and the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. What's going to be talked about today and this work on street sweeping is potentially hugely important for MS4 permitted cities and other entities around the country. We're focused on phosphorus in this presentation and in this work. It's the nutrient we chase here in Minnesota. One of the important things is there's a lot of phosphorus in street sweepings. We can measure it. These researchers have done a remarkable job of developing protocols to measure phosphorus in street sweepings. Then we have a different set of protocols correlated with those more scientific measurements that cities can do easily and inexpensively. And all that serves as the basis for a crediting system under stormwater regs. MS4 cities can claim credit under their MS4 permits, and they can use this to demonstrate progress toward meeting TMDL waste load allocations. All of this can be linked to a locally implemented enhanced street sweeping program. That program can be optimized based on tree canopy cover and phenology, when the trees are dropping seeds, flowers, and fruit. The cost effectiveness here is really quite amazing. At certain times of the year, we're picking up phosphorus at less than $100 a pound, total cost. That's headline news. All of that makes street sweeping one of the most cost-effective and just plain effective stormwater BMPs we have. And if your city is going to increase its tree canopy cover, you need to consider this because you've got to address the increased phosphorus from more leaves. So if you are an MS4 city, or if you're running an MS4 program, you should consider this for your city or your program. Have your state recognize this work and create a crediting program. You can incorporate street sweeping into your local stormwater program that makes stormwater funding available for buying street sweepers or operating street sweepers. You should get the tree canopy cover data for your city. You should optimize your street sweeping routes. You should quantify the results and benefits from your sweeping work. And you can find all this information in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. Can't recommend it more highly. Where there's going to be talk about the work that's left to be done, and it's considerable. We should be looking next at street sweeping and trash instead of just nutrients. We should look at sweeping and solids. We should look at the impact of enhanced street sweeping on downstream stormwater BMPs, rain gardens, ponds, etc. We should be thinking of streets not as just sources of pollutants, but as useful collectors of pollutants where we can relatively easily pick them up and remove them. Then the next thing is we should look at all the other leaves that we have in our systems. I want to end by saying a big thank you to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Mr. Trojan himself. They've done terrific work on this, and they've shown a real commitment on following through on all this work. The same applies with the good folks from the University of Minnesota, USGS, and Tetra Tech. And finally, go check the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. With that, I am going to send it back to you, Carly and Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. The check is in the mail for the last slide there. Carly, if do I have the ability to share here real quickly?
Yes, I can give it to you.
The world of COVID has really changed my life. I'm not sure for the better, but okay, hopefully my PowerPoint is showing up. Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Hobby, and Sarah is in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota. Her research focuses on the influence of changes in atmospheric composition, climate, and land use on communities and ecosystems, and on the effects of urbanization on biodiversity and water quality. She leads the new Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area long-term ecological research program focused on understanding interactions between people and nature in the Twin Cities. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She serves on the advisory board of the Earth Leadership Program and on several editorial boards. I believe I'll pass it back to you now, Carly, because you're going to advance the slides. And Sarah, go ahead and thank you for presenting today.
Yeah, thanks, Mike, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I don't seem to have the ability to share my slides, so Carly has graciously agreed to advance them for me.
Yes, let's see.
So I think you just have to swap your display. Yeah, awesome.
All right, so we're seeing the PowerPoint, right?
Yep,
All right.
perfect. Yeah, so Mike asked me to kind of set the stage today and talk about trees as sources of phosphorus to stormwater. So next slide. So I just wanted to remind people of the potential sources of phosphorus to streets and stormwater. So those include atmospheric deposition, which is mostly dust deposition for phosphorus. We can also get phosphorus coming into streets through erosion and overland flow. But what I'm going to focus on today is the role of trees in moving phosphorus into streets. Next slide. So I'll first talk about a little bit about just phosphorus in tree leaves and litter fall, and then I'll talk about litter fall contributions to phosphorus in street sweepings and some estimates that we've made of the contribution of litter fall phosphorus to stormwater phosphorus loading. And this is really, as I said, meant to set the stage for talking about the credit. Next. So just a reminder that when plants drop their leaves in the fall, so when leaves change color, plants do this thing called resorption or retranslocation, where they reabsorb nutrients from the leaf before it falls. But for phosphorus and nitrogen, on average, plants only reabsorb about half of the phosphorus. And so what that means is that the leaves that drop into the street are quite nutrient rich. So both in phosphorus, but also in other nutrients like nitrogen. Next slide. And this phosphorus, it's important to understand, is all in very bioavailable forms. So phosphorus in leaves is present as nucleic acids, so things like DNA and RNA, which we've been hearing a lot about RNA in the news lately. Phospholipids, so the lipid membranes that surround cells, phytate, which is a storage compound, and then orthophosphate. So all of the phosphorus that's in leaves is highly bioavailable, which means that as soon as these leaves fall into the street and start to be decomposed by microorganisms, either in the street or in stormwater or in receiving water bodies, that phosphorus can become available to fuel algal blooms. Next slide, please. And so trees that are growing adjacent to streets really act as nutrient pumps, whereby they take up phosphorus from the soil, they invest that phosphorus into leaves and flowers and other parts. And as I said, when they drop those leaves in the fall, they only reabsorb about half of the phosphorus in the leaves. And so the rest is lost to the street in leaf litter fall and other types of litter fall. So trees growing adjacent to streets are really acting as nutrient pumps that are moving phosphorus from soil into streets. Next slide, please. And we actually see substantial litter fall sort of in the spring and early summer, as well as in the fall. So this time of year in Minnesota, we're starting to see flowers dropping into the street. We'll start to see seeds coming into the street fairly soon. So early summer is a time when we see a lot of material coming into the street, particularly bracts and seeds. And then of course in the fall we have this, influx of a high amount of leaf litter fall. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about litter fall contributions to phosphorus and street sweepings. So next. So I'll describe a little bit about the street sweeping study that really has provided the data that are being used to develop the credit, or that we'll be describing later, that the folks from Tetra Tech will be talking about. So this was funded by the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. Next slide. And what we did, as Mike mentioned, is we partnered with 5 different cities. So Prior Lake was a partner in a previous study, and then we added Forest Lake, Shoreview, Roseville, and Minneapolis to the study in 2019. Next slide. And so partnering with all of these cities allowed us to capture a range of street sweeping conditions. So a range of route types ranging from residential to downtown areas. We also had a range in canopy cover from basically no canopy cover all the way up to almost 40% canopy cover over the streets. We had a range in frequencies of sweeping. We also had some variation in sweeper type. And for most of these studies, we were sweeping during the growing season, the warm season. I'll point out, because it's important later on, that in Prior Lake, we were able to do year-round sweeping and sweep at a really high frequency of every 2 weeks. So next slide, please. So what we did in this study was we collected subsamples, representative subsamples of swept materials. So these cities kindly set aside their sweepings for us to sample. And then we basically did a fractionation scheme that allowed us to measure the phosphorus as well as nitrogen and carbon concentrations in this swept material. And importantly, we divided the coarse organic material from the fine sediments and analyzed those separately, which allowed us to get a more precise measure of the phosphorus in the total sweeping load. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to be talking about the credit today, but I just wanted to point out that I put little yellow boxes around the data that we collected that were actually used to develop the credit that the folks from Tetra Tech will be talking about after me. The next slide, please. So I just want to focus on what the study told us about the contribution of trees to material in the street and to street sweepings. And so this figure just shows for each month the distribution of phosphorus concentrations in fine sediments and in the coarse fraction materials that we collected from all of these different cities during our street sweeping study. And the main thing that I want you to notice is that at all times of year, the coarse material, which is primarily the litter fall that's coming in from trees, has higher concentrations of phosphorus than the fine sediments. And so this material, as we've been talking about, that's coming in from trees is very rich in phosphorus. Next slide, please. And so if we look at the percentage of the phosphorus in street sweepings that's coming from this coarse fraction, you can see that that is variable over the course of the year. And it's particularly high in the fall months, especially in October and November, where we're seeing, upwards of 70% of the phosphorus that is in the street sweepings coming from this coarse material or this litter fall. So this is good evidence that trees are really an important contribution of phosphorus to what's coming into the street. Next slide, please. And if we look at the total phosphorus that's recovered in sweepings as a function of canopy cover, you can see that there is a significant positive relationship between the total phosphorus that we recover in sweepings and canopy cover, and this is particularly true at certain times of the year. So next slide. So I've just highlighted the months where we see this relationship being the strongest. And as we would expect, it's strongest in June, where we have a lot of seeds coming into the street, and then in the fall months where we have a lot of leaf litter fall coming into the street. Next slide, please. So what is the evidence? We have further evidence then that litter fall phosphorus is contributing to stormwater phosphorus loading. So next slide. So I want to just show you some results from a study that was led by Ben Janke here at the U, where he was able to get stormwater phosphorus concentration and loading data from a number of watersheds around the Twin Cities metro, and I've included the partners on the right there who shared their data with us. We're extremely grateful to be able to analyze this rich data set of stormwater nutrient data. Next slide. So we compared the average tree canopy over the streets in all of these watersheds where we were able to get stormwater nutrient concentration data. And you can see that the phosphorus concentration in stormwater is positively related to tree canopy over the streets, which is what we would expect if trees are contributing significant phosphorus to the street. Next slide, please. And further evidence comes from looking within a watershed across the season. So these are data from a small residential watershed in St. Paul, and these are data that were collected by Capital Region Watershed District. And you can see that this is almost 10 years of data, just looking at the average phosphorus concentrations in stormwater. So we see a peak associated with snowmelt, where a time of year where we have a lot of runoff. And then we see another peak in the spring associated with that, that peak in litter fall that we see in the early summer. And then we see another peak in phosphorus concentrations in the fall associated with that peak leaf litter fall. Next slide, please. And so we've done some sort of back of the envelope calculations to ask, well, how do litter fall phosphorus inputs to streets compare to stormwater runoff phosphorus yields? So next slide, please. So for these calculations, we narrowed in our focus on some watersheds that are monitored by Capital Region Watershed District, where we were able to augment the data that they collect with our own data to get good annual estimates of stormwater phosphorus loading. Next slide. And then we were able to estimate the amount of phosphorus coming into the street in litter fall using our data from Prior Lake. So next slide. So as I mentioned, for Prior Lake, we had really high resolution temporal data on street sweeping, where we were doing sweeping every 2 weeks over the course of 2 years. And so we could estimate from that the total annual amount of phosphorus that was coming into streets for some routes that varied in their tree canopy cover. And from that, we developed a relationship, just a linear relationship between canopy cover and the amount of material being collected by the street sweeper annually. And then we used a high resolution canopy cover map developed at the University of Minnesota for this region of St. Paul, where we have good annual stormwater phosphorus loading estimates, to basically map our estimates of litter fall into the street onto these watersheds. Next slide. And then we could compare the amount of litter fall coming into the street with the estimates of annual phosphorus loading in stormwater that we obtained using Capital Region Watershed District monitoring data. Next slide. And so these are these back of the envelope calculations, where as a function of fractional canopy cover over the street, so the proportion of the street that's covered by tree canopy cover, you can see that there's an increase in the annual litter fall inputs to streets. Those are the green dots. And so each of those dots represents a watershed. And then there's also an increase in the annual runoff phosphorus in stormwater, and those are the blue squares. So we estimate that between 37 to 64% of that litter fall phosphorus into streets are equal to about 37 to 64% of what's being exported in stormwater. So a substantial contribution to stormwater phosphorus loading. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I hope I've convinced you that trees can contribute substantial bioavailable phosphorus to streets and stormwater. And the implications of this are that street sweeping should reduce stormwater phosphorus loading. So of course, the holy grail would be to implement an enhanced street sweeping program and demonstrate a reduction in stormwater phosphorus loading. And so fortunately, Bill Selbig has done that study, and he's going to be telling you about that in a little while. So next slide. So I just want to end again by acknowledging my collaborators. It's been our team at the University of Minnesota, and then the teams at MPCA and Tetra Tech. And last slide. And then of course, we couldn't have done this work without our city partners, as Mike mentioned. And I also want to acknowledge our funding for this project and for the Prior Lake project that we did previously. So I'll stop there, and I think we're holding questions until the very end, but thanks for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. Good information. Carly, if you could pass it back to me for just a second. As Sarah did mention, we will defer questions to the end, but please put questions in the chat box. I am monitoring the questions, and hopefully we'll have time to get to most or all of those. So hopefully my PowerPoint is showing here. Our next speakers are Aileen Malloy and Hillary Yance from Tetra Tech. They'll be talking about the tool that has been developed, as well as some draft guidance for street sweeping that is currently in development. Aileen is a project manager, and she shows up in the upper right portion of the screen here. Aileen is a project manager and environmental scientist at Tetra Tech. She provides technical and programmatic support to federal, state, and local government clients in stormwater management, watershed planning, and TMDL development. She also supports MS4 jurisdictions in meeting permit requirements and TMDL allocations. Hillary, shown on the left here, is a professional hydrologist and environmental scientist at Tetra Tech. As a member of both the watershed modeling and stormwater engineering teams, she has worked on a wide variety of projects across the United States with Tetra Tech over the last 9 years. So with that, I will pass it, I believe, to you first, Aileen, and then you can pass it to Hillary from there. And thank you.
All right. Hopefully you all can see this.
Yes, we can see
Okay.
your slide.
Great. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about today is the street sweeping credit calculator, and that's going to include doing a live demonstration of how it can be used. We did a presentation back in October where we presented a draft version. This is a much more final version, and we'll work through a couple of examples. So MPCA asked us to assist in developing a street sweeping phosphorus reduction credit to help the jurisdictions meet TMDL and MS4 permit requirements and encourage street sweeping, not just for aesthetics or leaf removal, but also for water quality improvements specifically. So as has been mentioned, MPCA partnered with the University of Minnesota and us at Tetra Tech to improve the empirical relationships used to predict phosphorus content of street sweeping materials and develop a user-friendly crediting tool. So prior to developing this tool, we went out and reviewed other common methods that are used throughout the country for crediting we found that many jurisdictions have nutrient and sediment loading credits based on mass reductions or loading rate efficiency reductions. And in addition to several relatively simple crediting methods, we found that the Chesapeake Bay watershed jurisdictions have the most complex approach to determine a reduction efficiency, which requires accounting for miles swept, the frequency of sweeping on each mile, and the type of sweeper used. And that's a model-based crediting approach. So for the Minnesota credit, MPCA wanted to develop an approach that's data-driven and encourages actual measurement rather than relying on default values. So prior to considering a specific approach, MPCA developed a survey to determine what proportion of municipalities are already sweeping, identify the general trends in sweeping technology and data collection, and gauge initial interest in having a street sweeping credit. And the results of that survey showed there's a strong interest in participating in a street sweeping phosphorus reduction crediting program. And most respondents said they are already collecting some level of data on the materials swept. Based on the data that our team thought would be available, several crediting methods were considered, including direct measurement, surrogate measures, and modeling. And while the volume of street sweeping material was initially considered as a potential option, there was insufficient data to evaluate that relationship to phosphorus. So as Sarah has already mentioned, the university conducted a study of phosphorus content in sweeper materials from 5 municipalities in the Minneapolis area. As she said, the street sweeper samples were collected from a variety of routes with different sweeping frequencies, sweeper types, and across all different seasons. What they found was the strongest predictor of phosphorus concentrations was the organic matter content in the sweepings shown in these figures here. However, there were also clear trends noted in seasonal concentrations of phosphorus when the only metric used was the dry mass of material collected. In those instances, total phosphorus concentrations in October and November trended about twice as high as other months of the year. I just want to point out there is this regression equation here that will come into play when we get into the tool. So using the data from the university's study, we built a credit calculator tool. The tool is designed to be easy to use and provide a few options for crediting based on locally available data. There are 3 different options to calculate phosphorus reduction credits, and which one you choose is really based on the amount of data you have available. So the most preferred method involves the determination of the total dry mass of swept materials and a laboratory analysis to determine the organic matter content. However, the other methods are provided for jurisdictions that are looking for maybe a less data-intensive approach. And so these other options include just providing the dry mass without an organic matter analysis, or providing the wet mass or the fresh mass of what's been collected, or providing the curb miles swept. So option 3 is providing the curb miles swept, and that can be used if the only information you have is your curb miles. It requires the least amount of data, but it also has the most uncertainty about the actual amount of phosphorus removed. And so any credits using option 3 are extremely low and are based on the results of street sweeping modeling using the P8 model with the default values recommended by MPCA. So selecting between these options is a relatively simple process. We have this flowchart that illustrates the path to selecting which crediting method is most appropriate. If you already have a sweeping program in place, you can use the flowchart to select the crediting method based on the information you have. If you're considering developing a street sweeping program, the data collection elements here can help guide you to better understand what you should be collecting in order to set yourself up for each option. I'm not going to go through all the details of this, and as we walk through the calculator demonstration, all of the data requirements are going to become clear, but I wanted to point out that this flowchart's available and it will be included in the forthcoming user guide for the calculator. Okay, so now I'm going to move into a demonstration here, so bear with me as I change over. Okay.
And while you're doing that, Aileen, I'll just remind people to please put questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar.
Okay, hopefully the spreadsheet is visible to you all now.
It is.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start by pointing out that when you open the tool, there are 4 tabs along the bottom here. There's the README, the calculator, the methodology, and the tracking. So the README tab provides a brief introduction and describes the remaining tabs. You can note at the bottom here that the user guide is mentioned. This is essentially the instruction manual for using this credit calculator tool, and it is strongly recommended that you review that documentation before you use the calculator. So the next tab is the actual calculator, which we'll come back to in a minute. Then the third tab is the methodology, and this provides the underlying data behind the calculator and provides some more detailed information on the derivation of the values that are used in the tool. And the last tab is the tracking tab. And this is a place where the user can keep all of the street sweeping credit calculation records. It's completely editable and it can be customized by the user in any way that makes it the most useful for you. I've already populated it with some of our scenarios and we'll walk through those in a second. So let's circle back to the credit calculator. The yellow fields are where you can enter data if it is available. There's a space at the top here where you can enter a project name if that's useful for record keeping. Next, there are the 3 credit calculation options. We have option 1, dry mass, option 2, wet mass, and option 3, the curb miles. And once your crediting option is selected, the user can enter the relevant data in these yellow fields, as I mentioned, and the tool will provide the resulting phosphorus concentration and then the total phosphorus removed for your scenario. So the tool provides predetermined phosphorus concentrations based on the data entered by the users. If wet or dry mass information is entered without providing the organic matter content, the associated lower quartile phosphorus concentration from the university data is applied. If the percent organic matter is entered, the phosphorus concentration is based on the regression equation that I pointed out a few slides ago. There are so many unknowns about street sweeping, and selecting this more conservative value of the lower quartile is based on a conservative approach that is the most protective of water quality and minimizes overcrediting. And under option 3, the phosphorus removal rate is based on the P8 modeling, as I had mentioned earlier. So let's walk through a few scenarios using some real data to illustrate how to use the calculator. So in this first example, we're going to enter a few sweeping events from Forest Lake, which is one of the participants in the university's street sweeping study. So we're going to use line 1 from the tracking tab here. And we can see that Forest Lake collected 14,994 pounds of dry mass from the sweeper load on May 20th. Because we know the dry mass, we can use crediting option number 1. So we're going to enter the dry mass on our calculator in option number 1. And we also know that since this occurred in May, it was part of the non-fall collection period. So we want to make sure our drop-down list says non-fall collection. And in this example, we don't have any organic matter information, so we're going to leave that field blank. So below the section, we see that the phosphorus concentration applied is 414 milligrams per kilogram. And the resulting phosphorus removal is 6.2 pounds. So we can take this with us back to the tracking sheet and enter our total phosphorus removed. So we're going to do another example with Forest Lake, and this time we're going to look at the fall leaf collection season. So on October 7th, the dry mass collected was 27,141 pounds. So we're going to enter this value in option 1, and you can just overwrite your previous data here. So because we're in the fall collection, we want to pick that drop down here, fall leaf collection season. And again, we don't have organic matter content, but as you can see, the phosphorus concentration has changed to 857. So you get about twice as much credit in the fall collection period. So we're typically defining fall collection to mean October and November, and that's what the data is based on. However, we're calling it fall leaf collection rather than specifying a specific month because this allows the user to account for early or late leaf drops. So depending on when leaf drop occurs and then also when the actual sweeping occurs, you can select fall leaf drop for whichever months it's actually appropriate to be used. So let's transfer our data over. And if you are copying and pasting, make sure you use the paste the values. Otherwise, you'll bring a formula over with you. Okay, so we can also look at option number 2 using the Forest Lake data. As an alternative to calculating the dry mass, the wet mass and the dry basis moisture content can be entered and will result in the same phosphorus removal. We'll use the same fall leaf collection event we just worked through. So the wet mass that equates with the 27,000 pounds of dry mass is 32,866. And we know that the dry basis moisture content is 21.1%. So let's bring these over to option 2. And again, we're in fall leaf collection. And our dry basis moisture is 21.1. So as you can see, the results are the same. So if you know the wet mass and the moisture content, you get the same result as if you just enter the dry mass. I also want to point out that the dry basis moisture content is different than percent moisture that you may be thinking of. There's a warning at the bottom here to explain that. The dry basis moisture can be over 100% because it represents the moisture content as a proportion of the dry mass rather than as a proportion of the freshly collected wet mass. The formula to calculate this is provided in the methodology tab right here. So you can do that, or you can use the calculator to automate that process. Okay, so let's do another scenario. This time we're going to use data from Prior Lake. During the earlier study, the university collected sweeper data from Prior Lake. And as part of that project, the organic matter content of the samples was calculated. So we have a spring collection here in April, and 2,668 pounds of dry mass were swept. We also know the organic matter content is 17.5. So we're going to add these to the calculator, making sure to adjust the season. Actually, in this situation, it doesn't matter. When you use the organic matter, you don't have to use the season. So you can put not applicable. And then we'll add our organic matter content. And as you see, once you pick not applicable because you're going to add organic matter, you will get a warning that there's missing data. But once we add it, you can see your phosphorus concentration, and this is for the spring, is 755, which is much higher than the default of 414 for the non-leaf collection season. And now we have our phosphorus removed, 2.2, so we'll copy that over. All right, so now let's move on to a scenario where we only have the wet mass of the swept material. In this case, the only information you need is the fresh mass of the material and the season it was collected. So we'll use an example from Roseville. During the study, all of this other data was collected, but for our purposes, we'll just say that they only have the wet mass. So in November, 45,000 pounds were collected. So we'll bring that over here and make sure we delete out the moisture. And make sure that's fall. And then we just take this result and add it back to our tracking sheet. So we can also use this sweeping event as an example using the option 3 crediting, which only requires the curb miles swept. So in this case, we know that the sweeping route was 22.1 miles. And so we add this value to option 3. and it will fill in the pounds per acre removed and the total phosphorus removed for you here. So as you can see, this is a substantially lower credit than if you had used the wet mass. And this is intentional. It's intentionally conservative because this is not based on actual sweeping data. It's just based on the model. So it does provide this small credit, but it's not the preferred approach, but it's really intended to encourage actual data collection from sweeping events. So for any of these options, it's really up to the user to decide whether to enter each sweeping event individually or each route individually, or if you want to aggregate up and do several routes or several sweeping events over time and just do one input. That's completely up to the user. There's no specific unit of time associated with the calculator. So as long as you've captured the correct season or averaged out your moisture or your organic matter content, you can aggregate in any which way that works best for you, or you can add every route as an individual line item in your tracking sheet. That's really up to you. And then you'll have your total phosphorus removed for your reporting purposes. So that's really all there is to the phosphorus credit calculator. The next steps on our end are developing some SOPs for sample collection and finishing up the user guide and developing some guidance on street sweeping for water quality benefits, which is what Hillary is going to talk to you about now. And just to finish up, I would like to thank all the cities that participated in the university study. Special thanks to Sarah for really helping out on this. This has been great. And then, of course, we want to thank MPCA and Mike for bringing us in on this project. And I think I will turn it over, make Hillary the presenter now.
Yep. Thanks, Aileen.
I see the share button.
So I'm going to be talking now about the guidance for street sweeping that we are developing. So this is not the user guide that goes along with the tool. This is a separate guidance. And so this presentation is going to cover the content for that guidance, and MPCA is going to be making this available for municipalities. Yes, cool. Okay, so the topics that will be included in the guidance document are the range of items that should be considered when developing or modifying to enhance a street sweeping program, with the main goal related to improved water quality. So the purpose of the guidance is to help provide background, research, information, summaries, best practices, and resources related to street sweeping programs in a way that's targeted for water quality improvements for receiving waters. I will be talking a little bit about all of these topics today. I can't get into a huge level of detail. That will be in the document itself. But I'll start with a little bit of a brief overview of street sweeping in general. So we've heard a lot today about street sweeping research and how street sweeping loads are related to phosphorus removal, but I wanted to take a moment and provide a little bit more context without going into a ton of detail. I believe the right top photo here speaks for itself, that street sweeping has been around for a very long time. It was patented in 1840 with the horse-drawn method, which is not used very much today. And then in the 1910s, we first saw motorized sweepers. So there were a lot of steps in between there, technological advances before we get to that high efficiency regenerative air sweeper we see on the bottom right. But I only have 15 minutes, so I won't get into all of them. But for the purposes of the guidance, we just want to be clear that we are focusing on mechanized street sweeping. We're talking about large complex vehicles that use different broom methods. Some use water, some do not. Some have vacuums, some have recirculated air to reduce exhausted particulate matter. But brooms that direct roadway debris into a hopper by some manner. And so what street sweeping is not is a vacuum truck to suck up raked leaves to the street. That's not its purpose. There are trucks that are made to do that. but it does pick up leaves that have fallen naturally into the street along with other debris more easily. It cannot pick up bulky items, and it can also miss tiny particulate matter as well. Depending on the type of sweeper you use, you may have higher efficiency, and that goes into that calculation of the total load you've collected. So if you were to sweep one street with a mechanical broom versus a regenerative air vacuum sweeper, you may end up with a larger collected load if you're using a more efficient sweeper, just to keep that in mind. So that's the equipment itself. And now the question that we'll cover next in the guidance is why do we sweep? So there are a lot of benefits to street sweeping. There's of course the improved aesthetics, meaning citizens are not seeing piles of sediment, trash, cigarette butts along roadways and curb lines and in roadside ditches and waterways. Sweeping also improves roadway safety. Accumulated sediment can be a real hazard for traction, even when you're thinking about bicyclists. And it can also obscure pavement markings. One of the key focuses of us today, as people have talked about, is the quality of stormwater runoff from our roadways. So sweeping means less sediment, organic matter, particulate metals, trash, road winterizing and de-icing materials that end up getting washed off into our streams. So street sweeping results in waste that may be reused, which can be considered another benefit, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. It also has the potential for decreasing the frequency of maintenance on stormwater systems due to reduced clogging, but that's highly dependent on the frequency and timing of your sweeping, which I'll talk about later as well. It's also very cost effective, as people were mentioning, to remove phosphorus. So how do we get to see these benefits? Another topic in the guidance is going to be about effectiveness, and effectiveness is highly dependent on timing. There are other important factors like sweeper type that I was just talking about, and the type of land use, that type of tree cover that you have, the amount of tree cover that matters as to the amount of swept material that is going to be present in any particular area at any particular time. And that's why timing leads to peak program efficacy. So on the right here is a buildup wash-off plot. So over time, we can see that the buildup and accumulation of sediment, de-icing materials, leaf litter, and trash that accumulate in the gutters of our roadways. That accumulated material sits there until A, it is swept by a street sweeper, or B, it is washed off by a large precipitation event, for the most part. So an effective street sweeping program aims to perform sweeping activities prior to large storm events when the potential for accumulated load interception from entering the storm drains is highest. So many municipalities sweep a couple times a year, which is great, particularly for getting those large leaf fall, flower fall, those visible organic matter related events. But every major storm that moves sediment and leaf litter and organics into your storm drain, every major storm like that is a missed opportunity for potential phosphorus removal credit. So municipalities that already have sweeping have potentially a lot to gain by modifying programs for strategic timing, which is related to that enhanced street sweeping program idea. Okay, so you've swept. You've determined how much phosphorus credit you could gain. But what do you do with that sweeping waste? So most municipalities generally dump sweepings at landfills, which does have incurred costs potentially. And I saw someone pointed out in the chat that there are this kind of suite of options that I've included here on this tab that we're going into in the guidance is from the MPCA fact sheet on managing street sweepings. So there are other options that you can consider with your street sweeping waste, but it really depends on the specific goals of your municipality and the budget you're working with, etc. So most municipalities generally dump into landfills, However, there are opportunities for recycling, composting, and even reuse. But it does require sorting after the waste is collected. So some of the options for reuse include winter road application, which may have implications for bringing that phosphorus back onto your roadways. Landfill daily cover is relatively common in some other areas, and even construction and development materials. Okay, so street sweeping is beneficial, and it has a lot of us are already sweeping, but how much money does it really cost as a preventative measure for stormwater quality improvement? There are, of course, costs to consider related to buying machinery or contracting out the services to a private sweeping company. There's the cost of fuel. Some street sweepers run on CNG, some are electric, most are just typical fuel. However, there are also considerations that can be cost related for traffic control, operator training, things like that. But when it comes down to a comparison across stormwater BMP types, if you're interested in getting the biggest bang for your buck, street sweeping offers the most cost-effective phosphorus removal method when compared to a suite of other common stormwater BMPs. So street sweeping removes a significant amount of dissolved phosphorus much closer to the source, as opposed to relying on pollutants that end up being swept down into these more downstream BMPs. Okay, so how can we improve, revamp, or develop a new street sweeping program? MPCA is offering a suite of tools at your disposal that are in the works. Aileen mentioned the standard operating procedures on how to collect the best data for credit, the credit calculator and user manual itself, and the guidance that I'm discussing here today. I also want to highlight one element about operator training that jumps out a little bit from the research that we've done. Operators are typically trained by sweeper machine suppliers. They can also attend courses on operation and safety, but the LRRB, the Minnesota Local Road Research Board, they found that efficiency of street sweeping is significantly enhanced when the machine operators understand why they are sweeping. So remember that your sweeper operators need to understand the program, the importance of their role in it, because then they will sweep more effectively. And to use an example here of a municipality that I will not name, that is not in Minnesota, a contracted street sweeping company that this municipality used for its residential streets did not alert residents when it would be sweeping, so no cars were ever moved prior to sweeping events. This meant that the street sweeper would sweep the road center line over and over again when it would go out because it couldn't get to the curb line, but that's where we know accumulation occurs. So keep in mind too that just because your gutter may not look dirty, it may have particulate metals, organics, things that are not as visible as leaf litter and larger coarse materials. So one element of the guidance document that we're also going to be including is compiling information from municipalities on practices that are actually used in the field. For example, of the surveyed municipalities, is anyone actually sorting and reusing their sweeping waste? You know, compiling that information in this case studies section is going to help be a guide for others as you review this document. So that's a work in progress. So in conclusion, street sweeping for water quality requires considerations for everything I've discussed here today, and perhaps even more once you start thinking about your municipality specific needs, goals, objectives, budgets, etc. So you should consider timing and frequency of sweeping, both of which may vary on routes you choose to sweep. So will you have city staff perform sweeping, or will you contract that service out? How will you handle your sweeping waste? And if you do sweep more frequently, will your existing waste management plan change if you have an increased volume of waste? How will you interface with the public with increased sweeping either in locations or in existing locations, but more often? Will you ask the public for help in identifying hotspots to target street sweeping efforts? Will you set up a residential notification system? Will you make sure that residents know that just because a street sweeper is coming tomorrow, that does not mean that they should rake their leaves and toss debris into the gutter line? So the key to a successful system is likely going to be an adaptive management. So allowing your program to be flexible and change with increased public interest and changes in development patterns in your area, shifts in hotspots, and considering what flexibility your department may have, and considering that element of strategic timing to intercept that accumulated waste before it's able to enter the system. So that covers the guidance and what I was planning on talking about today. So I will toss it back to Mike, I think.
Thank you, Hillary and Aileen. Carly, if you could pass the ball back to me for a bit. I feel like I'm in a basketball game here. I will share my screen here briefly. We were going to do a poll, but as you might expect, the poll isn't working. So before we get to Bill Selbig here, I'd like you to indicate, so we had a backup. We were thinking that maybe the poll wouldn't work. So if you could just indicate in the chat box, this is going to help us with outreach from this point forward. Just please indicate in the chat box if you are interested in any of the following for the tool and guidance. Training workshops on use of the calculator, videos, instructional videos, case studies, which Hillary mentioned. We'll have case studies, but if you are interested in those, let us know. If there's some other form of communication. So all of this information is not worth anything if we don't do outreach. So please let us know if you'd like additional information and how you would like that information. I posted in the chat box, there's no way we're going to be able to get through all the questions and discussion today. That's great. Please keep the questions and discussion coming. We will post all of that information, including the answers, in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. Eventually, it'll take us a little while to compile all that, but it will be there at some point in the future. So with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker. Aileen mentioned that we're using the lower quartile for our credit as a conservative value. We can always go back and increase credits. People tend to not like it when you decrease credits. So fortunately, there are folks with Bill Selbig being at the head of the list that are still looking into the unknowns, and there are a lot of unknowns yet. So with that, Bill Selbig will be our next speaker. Bill is a research hydrologist at the Upper Midwest Water Science Center of the United States Geological Survey. For the past 25 years, his research has focused on characterization of pollutants in urban runoff, identification of their sources, and evaluation of the techniques and practices designed to reduce their impact to water resources. Much of his research has been used to stimulate or amend water policy and guidance in the United States. In addition to his work at the USGS, Bill serves as science advisor for several stormwater research groups across the country. So Bill, thanks for presenting, and I'll stop and pass it to you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Okay. All right, here we go. Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. And by now, I'm sure that you've heard a lot of convincing evidence that street cleaning and street sweeping is a very valuable tool in as we address stormwater management. But what I'm going to do now is kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about some of the data that goes to support the tools that you've just seen described by folks at Tetra Tech and introduced by MPCA, and offer maybe some alternative ideas as well as dive into areas of unknown that we hope to address down the road in the future and make these tools much better. Before I start, let me just say I'm an advocate for street cleaning. I think most of us are, if anything, for aesthetic reasons. If you know, cities were to suddenly stop street cleaning, then I'm sure you would get a lot of resident complaints. But there are some caveats here that I think we need to be aware of. For the most part, we've been hearing evidence that street cleaning is really a worthy tool for reduction in phosphorus in the fall, and I certainly would agree with that. But it's not this universal panacea for year-round water quality improvement efforts. In fact, if we were to just take a look at street dirt, the particulates on the street, a clean street does not necessarily equate to clean runoff. And I support this with some evidence that we worked on a study almost 2 decades ago now, that if you take a look at the graph in the left, the bar charts, here we're looking at the individual efficiency of 3 different types of street cleaners: regenerative air, vacuum assist technologies, and mechanical broom. And these are probably the most often used throughout the country. And we look at the efficiency by individual particle size that's on the street. So for the larger particles, you know, the coarse sands, we see a fairly decent percent removal. Now this percentage is, we measure the dirt before the street cleaner, and then we measure the residual dirt after the street cleaner has passed through. So this is just a simple pass of these types of street cleaners. But you can see as those particles on the street tend to decrease in size, the efficiency of the removal tends to decrease with it. In fact, if you get all the way down to 63 micron, or that sand silt split, suddenly we start seeing a couple of these street cleaners increasing the amount of available sediment. And there's for various reasons for that. We believe that some of the larger, coarser particles provide armoring for the smaller particles. And if you take away the large ones, you are now exposing the small ones. The mechanical broom, oftentimes, maybe you've seen this in your own experience, that with those coarse wire bristles, they tend to just push around material. And if you have maybe some vegetation growing in the cracks between the curb and the actual asphalt driving lane, it can expose some of the dirt underneath of that vegetation. There's various reasons, but the bottom line is that street cleaners are very effective at removing coarse sediments, but maybe not so much the small stuff. The table to the right shows on a basin-wide scale what we assigned as a percent efficiency. So if we look at an entire residential area and you use regenerative air, you're going to remove roughly 80%, 75, 80% of the sediment on the street surface. And then that kind of decreases as you move down a low frequency mechanical broom. And by the way, low frequency means once per month, and a high frequency would be once per week. So essentially the low frequency once per month with the mechanical broom is doing nothing to remove the street dirt. It accumulates just as fast as you can remove it, if not faster. So we show these percent reductions, but this, so far what I've been talking about is just the dirt on the street. I'm not talking anything about what we see in stormwater runoff as a result of this management tool. The bottom line for this particular study was that we saw no difference in the stormwater quality. So with all of these types of street cleaning operations, we couldn't say with any statistical certainty that there was any improvement in the water quality. Well, why is that? There are a number of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that the particles that we see on the street, in particular those circled in the blue, the larger, the coarser ones, greater than 125 micrometers, they just don't make it to the storm sewer. Their mass is too heavy, the specific density is too high. Maybe for some of the most intense storm events with a high precip intensity, you might move some of that. But the high distribution of coarse particles on the street resulted in approximately less than 10% of the mass that we found in the stormwater. So they just doesn't get there. But that's not the end of the story. One of the reasons that we saw that particular result is because the study was done primarily in the summer. When it comes to, and there was a reason we did it in the summer and we stopped in the fall, because our street dirt sample collection method, as soon as we started getting a lot of leaves on the street surface, it really interfered with our sample collection method, made it much too time consuming. And so we decided, okay, we're just going to stop. But in the summer, the photograph on the left kind of shows you what's going on. The streets are relatively clear. Really, the only amount of material you have on there is coarse sediments and grinding from street traffic and so on. And we know from previous studies that the phosphorus is is mostly in the particulate phase. In other words, it's bound to the particle. Now in the fall, photo on the right, obviously things are much different. And we see a huge amount of organic detritus falling onto the street surface by way of leaf litter. And here we know that the phosphorus is mostly in the dissolve phase. And you can see that in the lower right of that photo, we like to call this a leaf tea that is developed in the stormwater, because as water falls and percolates through those piles of leaves, it leaches out a lot of the phosphorus, and the color that you're looking at is the tannins within the leaves. But a high amount of phosphorus is leached out of those leaves and ends up, and it's very easily transferred into the nearest stormwater conveyance. So the question then becomes, well, right, well, we know that leaves are a large source in the fall. Well, is there anything that we can do about it? And how effective could street cleaning and leaf management be at removing the amount of phosphorus? Can we quantify how much these two types of municipal programs work? So this began a research study we did a few years ago in the city of Madison. We looked at a paired catchment, essentially two medium density residential neighborhoods, probably very similar to what is found in Minnesota. And we measured the relation between these two catchments under a do nothing scenario, where there is no leaf collection and there is no street cleaning over the course of April through November. And the chart that you're looking at here are the average monthly phosphorus concentrations we found in the storm sewer for these two catchments. And you can see they almost mirror each other, where you get relatively low concentrations in the spring and April, and you see a little bit of a boost in concentration in May. But as was mentioned by Sarah and others, we see that because May, right around this time of year, we have a lot of pollen, we have seeds, and we have early leaf fall with some early leaf litter. And as such, you'll see a little bit of an increase in the concentration. But then as leaves mature, our streets are relatively clean of organic debris, and the sources of phosphorus are coming from other diffuse sources, and it remains somewhat consistent concentration throughout the summer until October and November. And you've seen that sort of signal in previous slides, where suddenly we have this massive increase in phosphorus concentration in October. And then in November, it's still quite elevated, although a little bit lower. And the reason is just quite simply because there's no new sources of leaves. Most of the leaves have fallen, and phosphorus is continuing to leach out, but it's still quite high. So this was under a no leaf collection scenario, no street cleaning. We decided then to say, okay, well, let's take our best effort to mimic an actual municipal leaf management program. Now, this was what we decided to do is not actually being done by any municipality, simply because it's just too labor intensive. But the whole point was to keep the streets as clean as possible prior to a storm. And that was our best upper maximal effort, because if we could not see any change in phosphorus concentrations by doing this type of action, there's no reason for us to continue the study, because any municipal action will also not produce any results. So here we are with leaf blowers right before a storm and measured the resulting phosphorus concentrations and loads at the end of the pipe. And you can see by that new red dashed line added to the chart we've already looked at, the new phosphorus concentrations. And look at that, we are now down to near summertime levels for the entire period of October and November. So you brought down those concentrations quite dramatically. And this action in itself resulted in an 84% reduction in phosphorus loading. So that was quite dramatic. And that was confidence that, yes, we most certainly see a decrease in phosphorus loading and concentrations if you keep the organic debris off the streets. So now let's move forward and start evaluating actual municipal practices. So this this was us embarking on a 7-year journey that allowed us to step through various types of management options that are commonly used here in Wisconsin and most likely throughout the upper Midwest in general. Don't worry yourself about all of the busyness going on with the axes labeling. Really what I want you to focus on here are the columns, the bars, the blue and the silver bars, representing total and dissolved phosphorus % reductions for each type of management practice. Now, each of these represents some combination of the photographs on the left. So we looked at a mechanical broom sweeper, we looked at a regenerative air street cleaner, and we looked at 2 different types of leaf collection. These are, collecting the leaf piles that are left in the terrace by the residents. And one would be what we call a transfer system, where you basically just push those piles into the street and then you move them into some awaiting collection vehicle and haul them away. And the other is a more sophisticated leaf collection mulching system, a vacuum mulcher. And then the other thing we varied is the frequency. So it's done either on a weekly basis or every other week. But the bottom line for this particular chart is that you can see the gradation of % reduction in phosphorus loading given those different types of management practices. And they range anywhere from around 30% reduction all the way up to 65, 70% reduction. But what's really interesting here is how closely tied it is to the overhead street tree canopy. So the more tree canopy you have, the greater that reduction we noticed. Now that's just one variable. The other, of course, is how often you're out there doing it and what type of technology you're using. And you might look at this graph and say, well, wait a minute, Bill, what's up with that dot there on the far left where you have almost a 70% overhead canopy, but you showed no reduction in phosphorus. And the reason we see that is because this particular scenario removed leaves only from the terrace. So in other words, only the leaf piles were collected. The streets were left alone. There was no street cleaning during that analysis. So this tells us that the piles of leaves in the terrace don't mean as much as the leaves that end up in the street. And that kind of makes sense because it takes a little bit more effort for runoff to occur from those piles than it does for those that are already in the street. So the other thing that we've learned from this is that there is definitely a positive linear correlation between the amount of leaves on the street and the amount of phosphorus that we measure at the end of the pipe. Here are 2 trend lines that we measured for 2 different study areas. And these are areas where we had weekly street cleaning. So this is relatively new leaves. Each week there's new leaves. And then if a storm moves through, we can measure the concentration and load of the phosphorus at the end of the pipe. And we can look back in time and say, here was the mass of leaves on the streets, all streets within our study catchment. And then if we just take a look at the slope of those lines, we can tag an estimate of the concentration of phosphorus per pound of leaf, which is great because this is now how you start to predict. You can start rolling this type of information into some predictive model that managers can use down the road and regulators can use to help managers come up with their TMDLs and permit requirements. The problem here is that we have 2 different lines. We have one, the blue line represents a fairly high concentration in grams per pound, and the red line is a lower concentration. Well, why is that? What it tells us is that you cannot rely on just one single number. It's not transferable to all different types of residential areas. And keep in mind, each of these represents a complete medium density residential area that might have quite a diverse mixture of different street trees. But this is the beginning of the information that is necessary in order to develop a curve like this on the right, where what most MS4s are really concerned with is, well, we're all about environmental preservation and improving water quality, but how much is it going to cost us? That's what we really need to think about when we plan. And obviously, the higher the concentration of phosphorus per pound of leaf, the greater, or the lower the amount, the lower the cost of removing that pounds of phosphorus. So you're basically doing the exact same thing. You're out there collecting leaves and sweeping the streets, but if you have a high concentration, it's going to cost you lower to achieve that TMDL than if you have a lower concentration in those leaves. So what we need to do is start picking these study areas apart by tree species and identifying, well, where does most of the concentration of phosphorus lie, and how does it actually leave the leaf, if you will, through exposure to runoff. There was some work by Ma and others in a paper that identified the top 10 street tree species throughout the country and broke it into regions. And in the Midwest region, you can see that it's fairly dominated by Acer and Fraxinus genus, which are maples and ash trees. And so we started on an effort to start taking a look at, in the laboratory, what is the decay rate, how much phosphorus can be leached from these leaves in both their intact version and in a crushed version, since we know that vehicles and wheel traction and all that can grind the leaves up. How much is leached out of the leaves over a 48-hour period? And you can see that it's not linear. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens over a steady period of time. But this is now a function. It's a simple first order decay function that you can apply an equation to, which now we can then, again, throw back into some sort of predictive model. So in summary, here's what we know so far, and you've heard this from the previous speakers already. We know that leaves are a major source of phosphorus in the fall, and that we know that the amount of phosphorus in that runoff is correlated to the amount of leaves in the street. Kind of makes sense. You have more leaves, you're going to have more phosphorus. You remove those leaves, you're going to have less phosphorus. The things that we're starting to learn is that we know the concentration of the phosphorus it varies by particular tree species, and we're learning as we move along here. We're in the early phases there. The frequency of the street cleaning and the leaf collection really is the driving factor. The more frequent you're out there, the less leaves there's going to be on the street, and therefore you're preparing for that next round of storm events, and it's going to result in less phosphorus being leached. Bottom line here is the cleaner the streets, the less phosphorus you're going to have. And then I'm just going to throw it again, so this is kind of food for thought, but it isn't so important on how you collect the leaf piles. I don't think you can just leave them, but the way in which you collect those does not necessarily matter as much as the way in which you sweep the street. That is really what should be focused on here. So that's what we know. But now I'm going to talk a couple of slides on what we're still learning. Well, for one, I mentioned this idea of identifying, well, how does phosphorus leach from leaves of individual tree species? There was a paper that was written by John Dorney back in the late 80s that attempted to do this. And when we first stumbled across this, I was very excited because I thought that was the answer. But as we started doing our own experiments, we quickly realized that they are not similar. Looking more at the Dorney paper, he took different species and put it in a container of water and swirled it around for a couple of hours, and that was the answer. Well, if we take a look at the chart on the right, where we extended that 2-hour experiment over 48 hours, you can see that after only 2 hours, that's only part of the story. There's much, much more phosphorus that's available for leaching. So the longer those leaves sit out there without being collected, the more they're going to be exposed to rainfall events, the more phosphorus will be leached. It will be less and less each time, but new leaves will fall on top of old leaves, and it ends up being a compounding effect. So we need to start expanding on this list of the top 10 street trees in the Midwest. And we need to create similar curves for all of these species. But that's just the Midwest. Now there's other regions throughout the country that do not share the same type of street trees. So eventually there needs to be a fairly comprehensive list of primary tree species in which these curves are developed. Then once we have this information, how do we use it? Now you've already heard presentation by Tetra Tech folks on the Excel model. And that is certainly one excellent way to go about estimating the amount of phosphorus you're removing just by simple collection of what's in the hopper. But there are other methods that might be a little bit more sophisticated, and I don't know if we're there yet, but ideally what we'd like to do is to be able to predict what the amount of phosphorus you're going to see at the end of the pipe based on some sort of watershed characteristics and management efforts. One of these that we're working on right now is the use of regression models. As I showed you before, we clearly see a positive correlation between leaf mass on the street and end of pipe phosphorus loads. But when we add in all the other variables of the watershed, the one predictive variable that rises to the surface is leaf mass. The problem is we don't know how do you effectively predict when leaves are going to fall. We don't know that yet. Not saying it can't be done, it's just we haven't gotten there yet. So it's a bit of a dead end at this point. But maybe there are other ways we can work around that. And one of those is the use of a model called WinSlam, which is used extensively here in Wisconsin, and I think is used quite extensively in Minnesota as well. WinSlam already has a routine that is designed for street cleaning, but it focuses on street dirt in itself and the pollutants attached to the dirt. But I think it could be easy modifications to include what we've learned about leaf collection and the amount of phosphorus in organic leaf litter. And then finally, there's some new work being done by the folks at the U.S. Forest Service with their iTree model. They have a module called iTree Species, which accounts for a number of different types of ecosystem services offered by trees, shading and habitat and whatnot. One of the things that they're considering to add is this water quality component. And as you can imagine, as cities try to expand and remove ash trees because of infestation of the emerald ash borer, what do we replace them with? Here's an opportunity for a model to be used to consider all of the aspects of what new tree species, including a low phosphorus content in the leaves. So this is work that's ongoing, and we hope to have some really interesting results in the next couple of years. And then finally, I just wanted to introduce this idea of how does leaf management, street cleaning really influence downstream BMP performance? There's been this notion of double dipping that's been introduced, and this is primarily a modeling relic, where if you have a string of BMPs, let's say in your model, each is assigned their own performance, their own efficiency, how much pollutants are reduced by a certain BMP, but then it travels down the treatment train to the next BMP, and that BMP is assigned its own performance. But if through leaf collection and street cleaning, if you are able to reduce the amount of available phosphorus in the first place, how does that influence, let's say, a wet detention pond where runoff flows in there? Because now you may have less phosphorus entering the pond. It may ultimately lose its efficiency. Not that it's working any differently. It's just that you once had a very high concentration coming in and a low concentration leaving. But now that very high concentration coming in has been reduced. It's been cut in half, let's say, just because you have an effective street cleaning and leaf management program. It then makes it appear as though that wet pond isn't working as well. So these are the types of things that need to be sorted out, is how does this upstream management effort, if you will, affect downstream management efforts. And then I'm just going to speak briefly a little bit about wet ponds. This is something that additional work that we're working on right now that has come from some exciting discoveries by Dr. Gulliver at the University of Minnesota. Looking at wet ponds can actually be a source of dissolved phosphorus. They can be exporting dissolved phosphorus under various conditions. And so and a lot of that phosphorus is bound to the sediment. Wet ponds are very effective at removing sediment. And under certain conditions, that phosphorus can then leave the sediment and be flushed out of the effluent pipe. But through leaf collection and street cleaning, you might be able to reduce the amount of phosphorus that enters that one pond in the first place. So how does that really affect its performance long term? So these are some of the questions that we are looking at. I'm sure there are probably others out there, and there'll be new ones down the road, and hopefully we can develop some new interesting scientific research projects that will answer them for our managers and regulators. And with that, I will leave this last slide just offering and opening up to questions. There's my contact information if you need it. And finally, just a note, I know we're focusing on Minnesota primarily, but I do want to mention that the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources has issued a phosphorus reduction credit for leaf management programs. It's in its second draft, and it's currently out for comment. There's a link at the bottom if you want to read more about it. With that, I will end it. Mike?
Thanks, Bill. Lots of really good information. We are at time, but we can hang on for maybe about 10 minutes or so. Obviously, if the presenters need to go, I understand. But if you can hang on for a little bit, that would be great. There's no way we're going to get to, Carly, if you could throw the ball back to me, that'd be great. Thanks. What I'd like to do maybe though is pick up on a couple themes that I heard. Before I do that though, some shameless self-promotion here. If you are interested, you could join our email list. This is not a newsletter, but it's just an email blast that I send out we'll be sending out roughly every 6 to 12 weeks. You can see in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual on the main page, the orange flashing areas where you can link to that. And then we do have a webinar coming up on the 26th of May at 9:30. Go to the events link on the left part of the toolbar, left toolbar in the Stormwater Manual if you're interested in attending that webinar. Here's information on the webinar today. It will be posted in the manual at the page called Stormwater Manual Webinars. We will get the chat box in there. We'll try to get as many questions answered as possible. Lots of great discussion. We probably should have had this for 2 hours, but 2 hours seems to be kind of a magic number when people maybe kind of start to tune out. So, but we will get all that information into the manual. We do have a page called Street Sweeping, which is gradually being populated, and we'll get that populated over time. So like I said, we can't get to all of the questions and discussion. I want to hit on a couple themes and see if our presenters have anything to add. One theme that came through was the value of trees. Trees have many benefits other than related to stormwater. And obviously there's a concern that the more trees we put in the landscape, the more we're going to affect water quality. And we've talked about that with street sweeping today. And we're considering that we don't want to discourage trees. We want to encourage trees. So we're trying to work with different entities, urban foresters, landscape architects, and so forth, to try to link all this. And I think, Bill, you touched on this a little bit in identifying the importance of tree species, for example. So this is a total package. It's not just about stormwater, but it's about multiple benefits in talking to a bunch of folks. So any of the presenters have any additional comments to offer on that theme?
Couldn't agree more.
I'll just mention, this is Bill, I'll just mention that there's ongoing research. Actually, it's over now, but we're looking at the stormwater volume reduction benefits of tree canopy in urban forests. That was in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service. And no surprise, street tree canopy provides tremendous benefits when it comes to the volume of water that reaches storm drains. So yes, it's beyond just water quality.
Okay, thank you. And any other presenters want to chime in on that theme? Another theme that I saw that came up a couple times was winter runoff. Obviously, these street sweeping studies has focused on leaves. In cold climates, we are seeing phosphorus come off in the winter. Sarah, I think you believed you provided an answer to that, and I'm guessing, Bill, you've also given this some thought too. Any thoughts about the importance of winter runoff and what work might be getting done on that topic?
I guess I can just say that some of the work that we've done with Cap Region suggests that, as much as 50% of the annual stormwater phosphorus export happens during that runoff period when the snow is melting. And, there's some work that's been done out of the University of Minnesota that shows that you can get a lot of leaching of phosphorus over turf grass during that melting period when you have overland flow on top of frozen soils. And so I would say that's an important topic for future research, is trying to figure out the relative contributions of that overland flow, the just leaching of material that didn't get swept up in the fall, maybe because the sweeping happened earlier than or stopped before all of the leaves dropped. So there's leaching of material that might have overwintered. And then there's also material that's collected in the snowpack, all that black stuff that you see when the snow melts, and we don't really have a good handle, I don't think, unless, if Bill's group has done work on this, of the relative importance of all of those and contributing to that pulse that we see during snow melt.
Thanks, Sarah. Anybody else want to offer any thoughts on that?
I'll just
Mike, go
go
ahead.
ahead. I'll just quickly mention that I agree with everything Sarah said. We have not really done much additional research in the urban sphere, but the same is true for the agricultural arena, where we see our highest dissolved phosphorus loading rates in the spring. And it's like Sarah mentioned, it's because of snow melt is easily able to transfer maybe over frozen ground. It's able to transfer that stuff into nearby waiting streams. So it happens on both fronts, urban and ag.
So my comment, Mike, is one of the most important lessons here is the research work that's gone into street sweeping just on the phosphorus side already has really important payoffs for water quality improvement, pollutant load reduction, and regulatory credits. The lesson there is that additional research could almost definitely have just as significant, if not even more important, results for all those issues. And we need to find ways to support that research and continue it moving forward.
And that actually touches on another theme that I picked up in some of the comments too, was this focused on phosphorus. Is street sweeping potentially beneficial for some other things like bacteria, pathogens, sediment, nitrogen? Sarah, you mentioned nitrogen. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
I mean, I think it's important on all those aspects. I'm really fascinated on the bacteria side, mostly because we have so few things, BMPs and approaches that we know are effective. Sorry, Sarah.
Oh, I was just going to agree. And yeah, that's an important research area, I think.
And one last theme, I really appreciate everybody. And again, I really apologize for not being able to get all the questions in that. We will, again, as I mentioned, post everything in the chat box with some, hopefully some answers to a lot of the questions or responses to the discussion. That'll take us a little while, but we'll get it there eventually. But the last theme I want to touch on briefly is the question of, well, that we talked about streets. There's a whole lot of other sources of phosphorus out there coming from yards and that, and how should that be managed? And I think I'll wait for the researchers to respond to this too, but I think the same basic principles apply, that if we can collect that material, that'd be beneficial. So we need to find ways to think about not just streets, but also expanding this crediting and phosphorus reduction to other sources like yard waste and that. Any comments from the speakers on that topic?
Yeah, I'll just quickly comment that the other sources of phosphorus, we tend to see a fairly constant signature, particularly in the summer. And, what are they? They're atmospheric depositions, lawn runoff, yard waste, pet waste. I think they are important, and they do have they do contribute to runoff. Compared to organic detritus and litter fall, they pale in comparison to those. So that's not where those efforts should be focused at the moment. But you're right, Mike, long term, they should be addressed. The interesting thing with lawn runoff, this was a big deal here locally within Dane County. Gosh, quite a while ago, 10, 15 years ago, where high-powered attorneys for the Scott's fertilizer industry were flown in arguing that use of their phosphorus fertilizers made a healthy lawn that then infiltrated water and you received no runoff at all. So there's nothing to worry about. Ultimately, that argument lost, and phosphorus in residential fertilizers is now banned in Dane County. So that has removed one of those sources. Maybe there's some similar application that could be applied in other states.
And maybe I'll just mention that when we look at runoff at a small catchment scale, and like a residential neighborhood, we do see that there are significant pulses that happen during really extremely heavy rainfall events, where you get a lot of overland flow from yards into the street. And we know that rainfall is becoming more intense with climate change. So it may be that the contribution of runoff is going to become increasingly important as storms become heavier.
Great, thank you. Just a couple.
Mike, I wanted to just say really quickly, Bill's paired watershed work is really brilliant and very valuable. I would love to see essentially 3 neighborhoods, one where very little's done to control leaves and stuff, another where street sweeping is done more frequently, and then a third where all the leaves and all the organic material from the trees is picked up in the yards and in the streets and through the entire year instead of just the warm season. That would be fascinating.
So that would be really fascinating. One thing that you have to remember is that, if you remove organic material from yards, you're removing that nutrient input. And so you're going to gradually create nutrient deficiencies for all of the plants that, people are growing in their yards. And so, now there were a lot of comments in the chat about what do you do with your yard waste or with the sweeper material. And it is a bit of a conundrum because you end up moving phosphorus from one part of the city to another part of the city, which ultimately is going to deplete some area of phosphorus. And so, the ideal solution would be to create a circular nutrient economy where you're returning those nutrients in the form of compost, back to where they were removed from. So it becomes an interesting issue to think about, especially in the context of, when we do have phosphorus fertilizer restrictions.
And being a green infrastructure advocate, I think we also need to think about lawns too. Our lawns and how they're being managed currently, is that something that we need to take a harder look at. So I'm kind of an anti-lawn person myself, but anyways, with that, there was a question about how many attendees we had. I don't know the exact number, but I did a real rough estimate. It looked like something on the order of 250 to 300, so it was very well attended. Great chat. There are a lot of questions about the tool for the Tetra Tech folks. I deferred on those for now, and we can huddle after to get back to that. So with that, very much thank you to everybody, to our presenters, and to everybody who's been involved in this project, and especially to all the people attending today. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.